You found me. I used to work as a freelance programmer after graduating from college. During downtime, I'd scroll through internet forums, not really looking for anything in particular. One of my favorite threads to browse was in an online community dedicated to urban legends and the paranormal. Most of the stories were just rehashed internet myths, but every once in a while something unsettling would show up. One day, a user with the handle K posted something that caught my attention. Has anyone heard of this site? xxxxxx.com? You can't find it through a normal search. The URL just pops up randomly in different places. Social media, obscure forums, but only for a short time. Then it disappears. Kay went on to explain that the site only ever had a single video. He had managed to access it once. It was mostly a black screen, just audio of a man speaking in a hushed voice. At first, Kay couldn't make out what the man was saying, but at the end, he heard something clear. You found me, but you were already found. Naturally, the forum regulars dismissed it as a hoax. But then Kay posted a screenshot. It showed the video page, a pitch-black thumbnail, with plain white text that read, You found me. Upload date, unknown. Duration, 2 minutes 39 seconds. It could have been faked, sure, but something about it was off. The format of the site didn't match any known video platform. The comments section was empty, as if no one had ever watched it before. A few days later, Kay posted again. I found it again. Here's the new link. I clicked it immediately, but all I got was a 404 not found error. Others in the thread had the same issue. Kay, however, insisted it had worked just minutes earlier. He shared another screenshot nearly identical to the first, but now the title was different. You found me again. Upload date, unknown. Duration, 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Kay described the video. Same guy, same dark screen, but this time his voice was clearer, and he said, You came back, but now it's too late. That was Kay's last post. At first, no one thought much of it. People leave online communities all the time. But then, another user mentioned that Kay had gone completely off the grid. His personal accounts went silent. No one had heard from him. A friend of his, who happened to be active on another forum, said Kay had vanished. According to that friend, Kay's apartment was found unlocked. His personal belongings were all still there. Wallet, keys, even his half-eaten dinner. But his phone and laptop were missing. The police weren't treating it as a crime, assuming he had just walked away from his life. After that, the forum moved on. Months passed, and I mostly forgot about Kay's posts. That was until, late one night, I randomly thought about that strange website. Just out of curiosity, I did a quick search. Most of the links were dead ends, but in the comment section of a deep web conspiracy blog, I saw someone mention it again. The site had supposedly reappeared. A new link was posted. I hesitated, then clicked. This time it worked. The layout was exactly as Kay had described. Plain black screen, white text. But now the video had a different title. You found him. Upload date, unknown. Duration, 4 minutes and 2 seconds. I clicked play. At first the screen was pitch black, just like before. Then, slowly, an image faded in. A man sitting in a dimly lit room. His hair was unkempt, his face sunken. He looked exhausted, disoriented, like he had been there for days. Then he spoke. You found me. His voice was raspy, weak, but it wasn't the voice of some stranger. It was familiar. It was Kay. I felt a chill run through me. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes hollow. Then he whispered, barely audible, Now, it's your turn." The video ended. Heart pounding, I shut the tab, closed my laptop, and tried to tell myself it was just some elaborate hoax. But later that night, an uneasy feeling crept in. Against my better judgment, I tried reopening the link. The page was gone. The entire site had vanished. And then, as I sat there in the darkness of my apartment, my phone buzzed. A new message, no sender, no subject, just 2 words. "You found me, double asterisk."
Subscribe if you dare.
The Midnight Visitor. James was a long-haul truck driver. His job often required him to transport goods across state lines late at night, and he was used to it. He would play the radio, sip his coffee, and drive through the darkness of the highway. It was just another routine night. That night was no different. He was cruising down the road, the clock showing just past 2 a.m. A few more hours to his destination. He figured it was about time to find a place to rest when he spotted an old motel along the highway. Looks decent enough. James pulled his truck into the parking lot and headed to the front desk. An older man with a sullen expression sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. "I'd like a room for the night." The man didn't look up, simply placing a key on the counter. "Room 108. "How do I pay?" The man finally glanced at him, his face unreadable. "In the morning." James took the key, muttered a quick thanks, and walked down the dimly lit hallway. The walls were old, with peeling paint and faded carpets. The place had a slightly eerie feel, but he was too tired to care. He just needed a few hours of sleep. After entering the room, he sat on the bed and began removing his shoes when he heard faint footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps moving along the hallway. Maybe another guest wandering around? Ignoring it, he lay down. Just as he was about to close his eyes, knock, knock, knock. James sat up, staring at the door. Who would be knocking at this hour? The front desk clerk? Another guest? Who is it? No answer. Just the same rhythmic knocking. Knock, knock, knock. James frowned and looked through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. What the hell? Annoyed, he opened the door. The hallway was empty. He glanced both ways, but there was no sign of anyone. Shaking his head, he went back inside, convinced it was just some prank. Lying back down, he let exhaustion take over. Knock, knock, knock. The same sound. Again. James gritted his teeth, getting up once more to check. He looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was still empty. Damn kids or something? He decided to ignore it. But just as he was drifting off, the doorknob rattled. James shot up, heart pounding. Someone was trying to open the door. He rushed over, gripping the handle from the inside. There was pressure from the other side, someone pushing against it. His grip tightened. Then suddenly, the pressure stopped. He yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He shut the door and locked it, twice. This is ridiculous. He stayed awake until morning, his mind racing. As soon as the sun began to rise, he made his way to the front desk. Hey, was someone walking around last night? Knocking on doors? The clerk looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Room 108. No one's supposed to be staying there. What? The man's expression didn't change. Guests who check into that room, they never make it to morning. James felt his blood turn cold. The clerk wasn't joking. You mean they just disappear? James asked, his voice lower now. The man nodded slowly. Some say they hear voices. Some see shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. But by the time the sun rises, they're just gone. James swallowed hard, gripping the counter. Has anyone ever made it out before? The old man sighed. A few, but they never talk about what they saw. They just leave, like you should. James didn't need to be told twice. He rushed back to his room, grabbing his things in a hurry. As he swung the door open, he caught a glimpse of the mirror near the bed, and froze. The reflection showed something else standing in the room, a dark figure, barely distinguishable, looming just behind him. His breath caught in his throat, and he spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. He bolted out of the room, not bothering to close the door. He didn't look back until he was in his truck, engine roaring to life. As he pulled out onto the highway, his hands were trembling. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the doorway of room 108. There was nothing. But just before the motel disappeared from view, the lights in the hallway flickered. James never took that highway again.
If you're still here.
The Forgotten Tenant. In a quiet residential neighborhood of London, there stood an old apartment building over 100 years old. Despite its age, it was popular among young professionals and students due to its affordable rent and convenient location. Ethan Walker, a 28-year-old architect, had recently moved in for those very reasons. He led a busy life, and the apartment's calm atmosphere seemed perfect for him. When he first toured the place, the building manager casually mentioned something. Some of the tenants say the previous resident still comes back from time to time, but it's probably just their imagination. If you ever need anything, let me know. Ethan didn't think much of it and settled into his new home. But after a few weeks, strange things started happening. Late at night, while watching movies in his living room, he would hear a faint knocking sound. Thinking it was the front door, he would check, only to find no one there. At first he dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him, but the knocking continued every few nights. Around 2 a.m., he would sometimes hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway or low murmurs from behind the walls. One night, after a long day at work, Ethan returned home past 2 a.m. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the couch, dozing off. That was when he felt it, a presence. He opened his eyes slightly and noticed something odd. The closet door in the corner of his living room was slightly ajar. He got up, walked over, and gently shut it. But later that night, he noticed it was open again. Maybe it's just the humidity making it shift, he told himself. But something about that closet unsettled him. The next day, he casually asked his neighbor Olivia, "Hey, have you ever heard any weird stories about this place?" Olivia hesitated before answering. "Your apartment. I heard the guy who lived there before you just disappeared one day. He left everything behind. His clothes, his wallet, even his phone. He was just gone." Ethan chuckled nervously, pretending not to care, but from that night on, he couldn't stop thinking about the closet. Eventually, he decided to check it out. He opened the door, and to his surprise, noticed a smaller, hidden door at the back. It looked ancient, untouched for years. Curiosity got the best of him. He grabbed a flashlight and pushed the small door open. Inside was a tiny, dust-covered space, barely big enough for a person to fit inside. In the center sat an old wooden box. With hesitant hands, he lifted the lid. Inside, there was a tattered notebook. Flipping through the pages, he saw a single phrase written over and over again. "I am here. I can't leave." On the last page, there was one final message. Don't forget me. At that moment, Ethan heard something, a breath, just behind him. He turned around. Nothing was there. But the closet door, it was slowly, steadily creaking open, as if someone on the other side was pushing it from within.
Subscribe if you dare.
The silent passenger. Lisa took the same bus home from work every day. On late-night rides, there were only a handful of passengers. The driver had grown familiar with her and often greeted her with a casual, "Long day, huh?" One night, as usual, Lisa boarded the bus and took a seat toward the back. Up front, there was an elderly couple, and near the door, a man in a suit sat quietly. The bus was eerily silent. The dim glow of streetlights filtered through the windows, casting flickering shadows. The worn leather seats smelled slightly musty, and condensation formed a thin, hazy film on the glass. As the bus pulled away, Lisa absently scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing outside at the darkened streets. The rain was falling steadily, droplets tracing patterns on the window, neon lights bleeding into the wet pavement. After a few stops, she noticed something strange. The silence in the bus felt heavier than usual. The elderly couple and the suited man remained still, their eyes fixed ahead. The driver's radio was off, and only the low hum of the engine filled the air. At the next stop, the elderly couple got off. The doors shut, and the bus rolled on. Lisa, feeling the weight of the silence, glanced toward the man in the suit. He was looking at her. Startled, she quickly averted her gaze. Maybe it was just a trick of the dim light. She hesitated, then cautiously glanced back. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, staring at her, his face shrouded in shadows. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as if he had been watching her all along. A chill ran down her spine. Trying to stay calm, she shifted her focus to the bus's overhead mirror. It should have reflected the suited man's seat. Slowly, she looked up. There was no one there. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. That was impossible. She had just seen him. Suppressing the rising panic, she pressed the stop button. As soon as the bus halted, she rushed out, feeling the cold air hit her face. The doors closed behind her with a mechanical hiss, but she didn't look back. The next evening, at the bus stop, Lisa hesitated before boarding. When she finally did, the driver greeted her as usual, but curiosity gnawed at her. "Hey, last night, that man in the suit, where did he get off?" she asked. The driver looked at her puzzled. "There was no one else on the bus. You were the only passenger." Lisa felt the color drained from her face. "But I saw him. He was watching me." The driver's expression darkened slightly. He let out a slow sigh. "That back seat you were sitting near. A few years ago, a man boarded the bus and never got off." "What do you mean?" "He was found at the end of the route, still in his seat. No one noticed until then. Cold as stone. The police checked, but they couldn't figure out who he was. Since then, people who sit near that seat sometimes say they feel someone watching them." Lisa never took that bus again.
Subscribe if you dare.
The Woman in the Mirror. This is a story from China. Some say mirrors are just glass, but in China there are those who believe they can hold things inside. Liu Wen had just moved into a small apartment in Guangzhou. The rent was cheap. It was close to her job. The building was old, but nothing seemed too strange. Except for one thing. In the bedroom, there was a large mirror mounted on the wall. The frame was made of dark, aged wood. Something about it felt off. She asked the landlord if she could remove it. The old man hesitated, then shook his head. It's best to leave it as it is. Liu Wen frowned. She wanted to ask why, but the landlord simply walked away. At first, she didn't think much of it. But a few nights later, just as she was about to fall asleep, she felt something. Something watching. She turned her head and saw herself in the mirror. Of course, it was just a reflection. Same face, same clothes, but something was wrong. The movements were slightly delayed. Her blinks came a fraction of a second too late. Liu Wen stared. Then, shaking her head, she lay back down. It's just my imagination. She closed her eyes, but the feeling didn't go away. One night, lying in bed, she turned her head again. This time, she saw it. Her reflection moved on its own. Liu Wen's heart pounded. She hadn't moved, but her in the mirror had turned and was staring right at her. She gasped and sat up. The reflection did the same. It was normal again. She swallowed hard. I must be exhausted. She switched off the light. The next morning, everything seemed fine. She stood in front of the mirror. But then, she noticed something. The fingers in the reflection. They were too long, reaching, grasping. That afternoon at work, she mentioned the mirror to a colleague. An older woman overheard. Her face went pale. An old mirror, you say? She whispered. In China, we believe that mirrors can trap spirits. Liu Wen laughed, but deep down, she felt it. The unease. That night, she made a decision. She was going to get rid of the mirror. She grabbed a tool and pressed it against the wooden frame. The moment she did, the lights flickered. Darkness for just a second, and in that second, her reflection smiled. Liu Wen froze. She wasn't smiling, but the woman in the mirror was, grinning, watching. Her breath caught in her throat. Number. That wasn't her anymore. Something else was in there. Something trying to get out. Liu Wen turned and ran. Her fingers touched the door handle. Then, tap, tap, tap. A sound from the mirror, as if something inside was knocking. The next morning, the landlord found the door locked. No sign of a break-in. No sign of Liu Wen. Everything was as it should be. Except for the mirror. Its once clear glass was now covered in faint fingerprints, pressed against the surface, as if someone was inside, trying to get out.
Subscribe if you dare.
The whispering voice at night. This is a story from Brazil. People say you should never answer when someone calls your name at night. Why? Because the one calling you might not be human. Ricardo Alves lived in a quiet town outside São Paulo. Far from the noise of the city, his home was peaceful. Right behind his house was a dense forest. People called it Mata da Sombra, the shadowed forest. Nobody went near it after dark, but Ricardo didn't believe in that kind of thing. He had grown up in the city, where ghosts and legends were just stories to scare kids. One night, he was standing on his balcony, smoking a cigarette. The wind was cool. The night was still. Then he heard it. Ricardo. A whisper drifting through the air. He froze. Someone was calling his name. Software almost too soft. Who's there? He turned to look toward the trees, and under the pale moonlight, something was standing at the edge of the forest. The next morning, Ricardo told his friend Luis about it. I heard someone call my name last night. Luis's face went pale. You didn't answer, did you? Number. I thought it was some idiot playing a prank, but when I went to check, no one was there. Luis let out a breath. Good. You were lucky. Ricardo frowned. Why? In Brazil, we have a saying. If someone calls your name at night, never answer. That's just superstition. Luis lowered his voice. Not if the thing calling you wasn't human. That night, Ricardo stood on his balcony again. The breeze was cool. The forest was dark. And then... Ricardo. His blood ran cold. Again. Closer this time. Who's there? The words slipped from his mouth before he could stop them, and the moment he spoke, something moved in the trees. Ricardo's heart pounded. A shadow stepped out from the darkness. It had a shape like a man, but it wasn't. Its limbs were too long. Its body was too thin. Its face was swallowed by the night. But somehow, Ricardo knew. It was smiling. Step, step. It moved toward him, soundless. The wind had stopped. Nothing stirred. Then, from right behind him, Ricardo. The next morning, Luis went to Ricardo's house. The front door was wide open. The house was empty. A half-smoked cigarette sat on the balcony railing, untouched. It was as if Ricardo had been standing there and vanished. Luis turned to look at the forest. It was quiet, but he knew. Ricardo was gone, because he had answered, and whatever had called him had taken him away.
If you're still here.
The Woman Beneath the Water. This is a story from Thailand. In Thailand, people believe that spirits live in water. Lakes, ponds, wells. Some are sacred, but some are cursed. And they say that if you ever hear a voice calling your name near the water at night, you must never turn around. Kanak had been away from his hometown for years. He grew up in a small village but left for the city to work. Now, for the first time in over a decade, he was back. Not much had changed. The same old houses, the same quiet roads, the same Buddhist temple at the center of the village, and at the edge of town, the dried-up pond. Kanak stopped as he passed by. It's still here. As a child, he was always warned never to go near it. Stay away from that pond at night. There's something inside, the spirit of the water, Fibanam, a spirit that drags people down. Back then, he was terrified of the stories, but now, he just laughed. There's not even any water left. That night, he went to bed without another thought. In the middle of the night, plop, plop, a sound. Kanak's eyes opened. Water? That didn't make sense. There were no rivers, no lakes in this village, except one, the pond. Kanak sat up, listening. Silence. Then, Kanak, a whisper, calling his name. He stepped outside. The village was completely still, but in the distance, the pond was full of water. Just hours ago, it had been dry. Now, it was dark, deep, rippling under the moonlight. Plop, plop. The surface moved. Kanak's breath caught in his throat. Someone was standing in the middle of the water. Laying woman. She wore a white dress, her long black hair trailing into the water. Her head was tilted down, her face hidden. Kanak's pulse quickened. Who is that? Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Their eyes met, and Kanak froze. Her face. It wasn't human. Her skin was black and rotting. Her mouth stretched too wide, torn open at the corners. Water dripped from her lips, her dead white eyes staring straight at him. Then her mouth moved. Come with me. Canuck couldn't even scream. The woman took a step forward, but she didn't sink. She walked on the water. Coming closer, step by step, Canuck turned and ran. The next morning he returned to the pond. He had to see. He had to know if it had been real. And when he arrived, the pond was dry, just as it had been before. But something made Canuck's stomach.
Subscribe if you dare.
Blood Harvest. This is a story about a village hidden deep in the mountains of America. Journalist Michael Carter was investigating an ancient and forbidden cult. He was chasing rumors of a mysterious ritual called Red Harvest, a ceremony said to be performed in a village so remote that it didn't even appear on maps. The village was deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No government records mentioned its existence. Few had ever visited, and the rare survivors who made it back refused to speak of it. Michael ignored the warnings. Using an old hand-drawn map, he made his way into the wilderness. Thick fog covered the forest, making it hard to see. After hours of walking, he noticed lights flickering through the trees. Ahead of him, a forgotten village lay in silence. Too silent. As he stepped forward, people appeared from the shadows. Their faces were emotionless. The villagers surrounded Michael, whispering something in unison. Zaneth vur Talmar. Zaneth vur Talmar. The words meant nothing to him. Their voices were low, rhythmic, like an incantation or a prayer. An old man stepped forward, his head wrapped in dark cloth, gripping a staff carved with strange symbols. Thurashnal Zaneth, Vekar Limtur. Michael gestured, trying to ask if anyone spoke English. The villagers did not respond. They just stared at him, as if he hadn't spoken at all. What is this place? He took a step back. The villagers moved in closer. Suddenly the old man muttered something in a deep voice. Vekarthun Ralas. At his words, every villager dropped to their knees. Michael had no idea if he was being welcomed or sacrificed, but every instinct told him he was in danger. Then, from the crowd, a young girl locked eyes with him. She hesitated, then whispered in broken English, "Help me." The villagers led Michael to the center of the village, where a massive wooden cross stood. Hanging from it were human bones, clean, white, and countless in number. Michael understood. This village offered human sacrifices to their god, and tonight he was the next offering. Zaneth vur Talmar, Zaneth vur Talmar. The chanting grew louder. Then suddenly the girl grabbed his hand. "Run! We go now!" Her broken words were enough. Michael turned and sprinted. The villagers gasped, then immediately began chasing them. "Vekar Limtur! Vekar Limtur!" The girl pulled his arm as they ran into the forest. Michael didn't know where to go, but he knew he had to keep running. Behind them, torches flickered as the villagers stormed into the woods. Thurash Zenith. Thurash Zenith. Michael clutched the girl's hand. Where do we go?" She panted. "Bridge. Old. That way. We go." She pointed toward the darkness. Then, suddenly, her face twisted in fear. Torches, coming from all sides. "Run fast." The two ran with everything they had. Then, just ahead, an old, rotting wooden bridge, their only way out. Michael turned to the girl. "Go. Cross first." Just then, Vekar Thun Ralas. The old man's voice echoed through the trees. The girl froze in place. Her eyes widened in terror. "No. Can't move." Michael grabbed her arm, pulling hard, but it was no use. She was trapped. "Damn it." He turned. The villagers were nearly upon them. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You. Go." Michael shook his head. "No. I won't leave you." She smiled sadly. "Tell outside world. Stop. This." Michael clenched his fists. Then he turned and ran. Weeks passed. Michael tried to tell the world about the village, but no one believed him. There's no such place. No record of it anywhere. Then one night, he looked out his window. In the dark, flickering torches swayed in the mist. Xanath Vur Talmar. Xanath Vur Talmar. A whisper brushed against his ear. The hairs on his neck stood on end. This couldn't be real. The village was deep in the mountains. He was in the middle of New York City, but the chanting grew louder. His hands trembled as he shut the curtains. He turned, catching his reflection in the mirror. Behind him, a shadow was forming. It took shape. The old man. Thurash Xanath. Vekar Lim Tur. Michael's body froze. His feet wouldn't move. His breath caught in his throat. In the mirror, the old man stepped closer. "Why did you run?" Michael tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then the air behind him shifted. Xanath Vur Talmar. A whisper, right by his ear. He turned slowly. The girl was there, but she was no longer human. Her skin was gray, her eyes pitch black. "You... leave me." Michael's chest tightened. "No. How are you here?" The girl gave a sad, hollow smile. "Ritual. Not finish." Behind him, the window creaked open. From the darkness, dozens of hands reached for him. "Vekar Lim Tur." The chant roared through the room as the hands wrapped around him. Michael was dragged into the darkness. The next morning his apartment was empty. His name erased from the system. No one remembered him.
If you're still here.
The House of Shadows. Deep in the mountains of northern Italy, hidden among the alpine slopes, stood an old mansion known as the House of Shadows. No one in the nearby village dared approach it. The elders warned travelers never to knock on its doors, but they refused to explain why. One day, a historian named Antonio arrived from Rome, tasked with investigating the mansion. He was a man of boundless curiosity, fascinated by haunted legends and places shrouded in mystery. "It's just superstition," he scoffed at the villagers' warnings and set off toward the mansion. The mansion was more decrepit than he had expected. The windows were shattered, ivy clung to the walls, and the door barely stood upright. Yet when he pushed against it, it swung open effortlessly. Inside, the air was thick with silence. Dust coated the furniture. The grand staircase was crumbling, and along the walls hung large, ornate mirrors. Strangely, despite the decay, the mirrors were pristine, spotless, as if someone had been cleaning them. Is someone still living here? But the house was empty. Antonio stepped inside cautiously. The air inside was cold. Though spring bloomed outside, the mansion felt like winter. He retrieved his flashlight and moved down the dimly lit corridor. Then he noticed something. "My shadow is wrong." The shadow cast against the wall was slightly out of sync with his movements. It mimicked him, yet it seemed delayed. He raised his right hand. The shadow followed, but a fraction too late. Then, for just a moment, so brief he almost doubted his own eyes, his shadow moved its fingers in a way he had not. "Am I imagining things?" He shook his head and walked further inside. In the grand hall, an enormous chandelier loomed above a long banquet table. But what caught his eye was the wall, lined with countless mirrors. Each mirror was framed in elaborate gold, relics of an opulent past. But when he looked at them closely, he realized something was wrong. His reflection was distorted. He leaned in. His own face stared back, but its expression had changed. His reflection was smiling. Antonio staggered backward. His real face had not smiled. "What is this?" Before he could finish speaking, The mansion groaned. There was no wind, yet the air shifted. The heavy doors creaked. The chandelier trembled slightly, and the entire house seemed to stir. Then, the him in the mirror extended a hand toward him. Antonio spun around. Nothing was there. Slowly he turned back to the mirror. The man inside was still watching him, but it was no longer him. This must be a dream, he muttered and pinched his arm. Pain shot through him. It was real. The figure in the mirror opened its mouth, but there was no sound. No whisper, no breath, nothing. Not only that, the entire mansion had fallen into absolute silence. No creaking wood, no rustling wind, no heartbeat, no breath, no sound at all. And then, his shadow moved. Slowly it peeled itself from the floor. Like a man rising from slumber, the shadow stood, independent of him. It turned. Antonio felt ice crawl up his spine. The reflection in the mirror was watching too. Every instinct told him not to move. But fear won. He took a step back, and the shadow lunged. Darkness swallowed him. The next thing he knew, Antonio was outside the mansion. The sun had sunk below the mountains. The distant cries of birds echoed through the valley. What happened? He checked his body. No injuries. Had it really happened? Or was it all some hallucination? Then, he looked down at his shadow. It was there. But something was wrong. It moved with him. Almost. A fraction behind. And sometimes, just barely, it moved when he did not. As if something was still there, watching. Antonio shuddered and hurried back to the village. The moment the villagers saw him, their faces turned pale. One man whispered in horror, "Your shadow." Antonio froze, and behind him, something whispered. He never turned around. Not again. Would you like me to create another story in the same format?
Subscribe if you dare.
The Whispering Sand. Deep in the western deserts of Egypt, there lies an ancient ruin where no one dares to go. The Bedouins who live nearby whisper warnings to travelers, saying, "Those who step into that place never return." When asked why, they simply reply, "The sand whispers," but they refuse to explain further. Daniel Warren, a British archaeologist, dismissed these warnings as mere superstition. He had spent years researching undiscovered tombs across Egypt, and one day he found a reference in an ancient manuscript. The tomb of the sun-devoured king. It was the same place the Bedouins feared. If this truly is the lost tomb of an unknown pharaoh, it could rewrite history. Determined, Daniel assembled a research team and set out into the desert. The entrance to the ruin was buried deep beneath the dunes, barely visible through the shifting sands. A dark crevice yawned open like a wound in the rock, and as they approached, an eerie chill brushed against their skin. It was midday, the sun relentless in the sky, yet here, at the threshold of the tomb, the air was cold as winter. "This temperature, it's unnatural," one of the team members murmured. "It must be deep underground." Daniel responded, shining his flashlight into the darkness. They stepped inside. The air was heavy with silence. Sand had crept through the cracks, piling against the walls, yet some of the ancient hieroglyphs remained intact. This pharaoh was executed? Daniel's assistant, Lisa, pointed to a mural. It depicted a king buried alive beneath the sands, surrounded by shadowy figures with twisted, inhuman shapes. "Are these spirits?" Daniel whispered. Then, "Shh, shh." A faint sound. The sand was moving. The team froze. No wind blew, yet the grains trembled, as if something beneath the surface had stirred. "It's nothing," Daniel reassured himself. He was wrong. The next day, they discovered a massive stone door at the tomb's deepest chamber. Carved into the rock was a single phrase in ancient Egyptian: "He who must never be freed." It looks like they weren't trying to keep people out, Lisa muttered. They were trying to keep something in. Myths, Daniel scoffed. The real treasure is what's inside. His team worked carefully, brushing away the sand, prying open the heavy stone. The moment they cracked it ajar, an icy gust of wind rushed past them, howling from the darkness within. A massive chamber lay beyond. At its center stood a colossal sarcophagus, covered in strange, intricate markings. "This is it." Daniel's voice trembled with excitement as he approached. Then, shh, shh, a whispering sound. Something, somewhere, was moving. "Did you hear that?" Daniel turned. His team stood frozen, staring at the sarcophagus. None of them had moved. Lisa's face had gone pale. "The sand, it's shifting." Daniel looked down. The fine grains around his boots were rippling, as though something beneath was breathing. And then, shh, shh, a whisper. It was not a voice. It was not the wind. It was the zakuikstatod sand itself that spoke. "We need to leave," someone shouted, but Daniel couldn't move. He couldn't look away from the sarcophagus. This was his moment, his discovery. He reached for the lid, and the stone cracked open. From within, black sand poured out like a living flood, spilling across the floor. It twisted and curled, rising into a shape. A figure. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just a shifting, writhing form made entirely of sand. And it was looking at him. "Run!" Someone screamed, but the entrance was already gone, buried beneath collapsing dunes. The sand surged, swallowing the team one by one. Lisa grabbed Daniel's arm. "Please, we have to go." He ran, pulling her toward what remained of the exit. But something had his shadow. Daniel glanced down, and his shadow was sinking. An unseen force pulled him back. His body dragged downward as if the ground itself had come alive. Lisa screamed. Daniel reached for her, but the sand swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard was shf, shf, the whispering of the sand. Days later, a rescue team arrived. Daniel and his team were never found. But outside the tomb, something had changed. A new carving had appeared on the ancient walls. It showed a group of explorers standing before a sarcophagus, and their shadows being pulled into the sand.
If you're still here.
A whispering sound. Something, somewhere, was moving. "Did you hear that?" Daniel turned. His team stood frozen, staring at the sarcophagus. None of them had moved. Lisa's face had gone pale. "The sand? It's shifting." Daniel looked down. The fine grains around his boots were rippling as though something beneath was breathing. And then, shh, shh. A whisper. It was not a voice. It was not the wind. It was the sand itself that spoke. "We need to leave," someone shouted. But Daniel couldn't move. He couldn't look away from the sarcophagus. This was his moment, his discovery. He reached for the lid, and the stone cracked open. From within, black sand poured out like a living flood, spilling across the floor. It twisted and curled, rising into a shape. A figure. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just a shifting, writhing form made entirely of sand. And it was looking at him. "Run!" Someone screamed. But the entrance was already gone, buried beneath collapsing dunes. The sand surged, swallowing the team one by one. Lisa grabbed Daniel's arm. "Please, we have to go." He ran, pulling her toward what remained of the exit, but something had his shadow. Daniel glanced down, and his shadow was sinking. An unseen force pulled him back, his body dragged downward as if the ground itself had come alive. Lisa screamed. Daniel reached for her, but the sand swallowed him whole. The last thing he heard was, "Shh, shh," the whispering of the sand. Days later, a rescue team arrived. Daniel and his team were never found. But outside the tomb, something had changed. A new carving had appeared on the ancient walls. It showed a group of explorers standing before a sarcophagus, and their shadows being pulled into the sand.
Subscribe if you dare.
Rorbor, the stone counter. In a small village hidden deep in the mountains of Greece, there was a hill that no one dared to climb. The villagers warned travelers never to step onto that hill, and above all, never to count the stones that lay there. They claimed that those who counted the stones never returned. And if they did, they were no longer the same. Elios Kostas, an archaeologist specializing in ancient Greek ruins, became fascinated by the legend. He had long believed that folk tales often had roots in real historical events, and this story intrigued him. Despite the villagers' warnings, he dismissed their words as superstition and set off alone toward the hill. The path leading up was narrow and rugged, with jagged rocks exposed beneath his feet. As he ascended, the air grew colder. Though the summer sun burned brightly overhead, an unnatural chill seeped into his bones as he neared the summit. When he finally reached the top, he froze. Countless stones were arranged in a pattern, small ones, large ones, all placed with eerie precision. They looked like grave markers, yet there were no inscriptions, no names, only silence. Elios took out his notebook and began recording his observations. Then, almost instinctively, he started counting the stones. 1, 2, 3. With each number, a strange weight seemed to settle around him. 14, 15, 16. The wind stopped. Not just the wind. All sound vanished. His own breathing, his heartbeat, everything fell into a vacuum of silence, as if the world itself had been swallowed by something unseen. Then, rustle. A faint shifting sound. Elios stiffened. Slowly, he lowered his gaze. Beneath one of the stones, a finger was sticking out. Pale, dry, covered in dirt, but it was moving. A sickening realization gripped him. This was no graveyard. This was something far worse. Then, from the gaps between the stones, more fingers began to emerge. One by one, they twitched and groped at the air, as if reaching for something. Rustle. Rustle. A stone tumbled over. Elios turned his head and saw an arm crawling out from beneath the pile. It was skeletal, the flesh cracked and dry. Then the stones shifted further, and something lifted its face. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet it was watching him. Panic surged through Elios. He staggered back, but the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Its entire hill was moving. The stones trembled, and the figures buried beneath them began to rise. This was no burial site. It was a seal. A place where the ancient dead had been trapped, not laid to rest, and counting the stones had been the key to waking them. Elios turned to flee, but then his shadow disappeared. Not behind him, not beneath him. It simply vanished. A second later, something pulled him down. A force, stronger than any human grip, yanked him backward. He screamed, clawing at the ground. But dozens of hands, cold, dry, hungry, dragged him into the stones. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Then Silence returned. Days later, the villagers came looking for him. There was no trace of Elios, but among the countless stones, one new on a non stone had appeared. The village elder sighed, looking at it with sorrow. Another one joins them. No one dared to touch it.
Subscribe if you dare.
The woman at the night market. In a city in Taiwan, there were rumors of a strange night market, one that was unlike any other. Night markets were common across the country, bustling with people, neon lights, and the scent of sizzling street food. But this one was different. Those who entered it never returned, and if they did, they were no longer the same. Joe, a traveler, was visiting the city. Exploring night markets was his passion, and every evening he wandered through different districts, sampling the local delicacies. One night, while chatting with some locals, he overheard a warning. This city has many great night markets. One of them said, "But whatever you do, never go past the South Gate. There's another market there." Joe was intrigued and pressed for details, but the locals refused to say more. They quickly changed the subject, their faces suddenly pale. Later that night, Joe walked through the lively night market as usual. The streets were filled with chatter, the scent of grilled skewers and fried dough floating through the air. But his eyes were searching for something else. The shucked South Gate. Eventually, he found it, a narrow alleyway leading beyond the main street. At the end of the alley, he saw dim lights flickering. Another market. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped through. The alley seemed longer than expected, and as he walked, the sounds of the bustling market behind him faded. When he turned to look back, the South Gate was gone. Ahead, the dimly lit night market stretched before him, but something was wrong. There were stalls lined up just like any other market, but there were no customers. Vendors sat behind their carts, silent and still. Their faces were blank, their expressions unreadable. Then he noticed her. A woman in a red chipao, standing beside a food stall. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, and she smiled as he approached. "Would you like to try some?" She held out a small bamboo cup filled with clear soup. Joe hesitated. Something about the woman unsettled him, but his curiosity won. He took the spoon, scooped up the soup, and drank. The moment it touched his tongue, the world twisted. The market lights blurred. The shadows around him deepened. The vendors, all at once, turned to face him. Their faces were like masks. No eyes, no noses, just wide, gaping mouths stretched unnaturally across their skin. The spoon fell from his hand. "Did you like it?" The woman in red was still smiling, but her lips had never moved. The voice, it was inside his head. Joe stumbled backward. The vendors were rising to their feet, moving toward him. He turned and ran. The market stretched endlessly in all directions. No matter which way he ran, he only found more stalls, more vendors, more shadows waiting. Then, in the distance, a red gate. The South Gate. Joe sprinted toward it with everything he had. He leapt through, and suddenly, he was back. The lively sounds of the normal night market surrounded him. The familiar sense of food, the bright lights, the warm hum of human voices. Panting, he turned around. The alley was gone. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. Then he saw her, the woman in red, standing among the crowd, watching him. He fled to his hotel that night and never returned to another night market. But even after he left Taiwan, something followed him. One evening, he glanced at the mirror in his home, and there she was, standing behind him, smiling. He never turned around, but every night he heard her whisper in his ear, "Did you like it?"
If you're still here.
The fog carriage. There was a rumor about the London Underground, one that only surfaced among late-night commuters and train workers. They spoke of a night train carriage that shouldn't exist, a carriage that only appeared past midnight, and those who stepped inside it never returned. And if they did, they were no longer the same. Edward had heard the story before, but he dismissed it as just another urban legend. He was a train enthusiast, someone who loved exploring old stations and lesser-known railway routes. One night, as the final trains of the evening were departing, he decided to see for himself if the Marion Diandrita, the vanishing carriage, was real. The platform was nearly deserted. A train slid into the station, its headlights casting eerie reflections on the tiled walls. Edward carefully scanned the cars before stepping into the last carriage at the far end. The doors shut. The train pulled away. Then he noticed something strange. The carriage was completely empty. Not unusual for the last train of the night, but something felt off. The windows were slightly fogged, making it hard to see outside. As the train entered a tunnel, a thin mist seemed to seep into the carriage for just a second. Then, a figure stood at the far end of the car. Edward froze. There had been no one when he entered. The figure was barely visible in the dim light, but it was unmistakably staring at him. He took a step back and pressed the button to open the doors to the next carriage. Nothing happened. Then the train curved sharply around a bend. The lights flickered, and suddenly, the figure was standing right beside him. Edward's breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. The figure was wearing his exact outfit, like a mirror image, but its face, there was something off about its face. The figure's mouth twitched upward, forming a slight, unnatural smile. Then it whispered something. Edward couldn't hear it, or rather, there was no sound at all. The noise of the train, the hum of the lights, even his own breathing, everything had vanished. The figure kept staring at him. Then its face began to distort. The skin stretched unnaturally. Its eyes sank deeper into its skull, and its mouth widened, splitting open as if its face was being peeled away. Edward turned and pounded on the doors. Through the window, he saw a station, but he didn't recognize the name. The speakers crackled to life, announcing the station stop. The voice that came through wasn't human. It was a sound like mist scraping against glass, a whisper that carried no words. The train stopped abruptly. The doors slid open. Edward bolted. But there was no platform. Only fog. An endless void of swirling, shifting mist. Then, behind him, the doors shut. He turned back. Inside the train, someone was standing where he had been. It was himself. The figure smirked, then disappeared into the mist as the train pulled away. The next morning, station workers reviewed the final CCTV footage of the night. One clip stood out, a man stepping onto the platform from the last train, but he had no shadow. Without speaking to anyone, he walked calmly through the station and vanished into the streets. Edward was never seen again, but sometimes, late at night, passengers claimed to see a foggy reflection in the train windows, a figure standing alone, and if you look closely, it looks exactly like Edward.
The Twilight Inn. Kazuki was traveling through the countryside of France when he began searching for a place to stay before nightfall. He was a backpacker, wandering across Europe while staying in cheap lodgings. That evening, as he walked through unfamiliar roads, he stumbled upon a small inn nestled within a forest. It was an old wooden building, its windows glowing warmly against the twilight. A worn sign above the door read, Auberge du Crépuscule. I didn't hear about an inn around here, but I guess this will do. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was modest but clean, with a cozy atmosphere. An elderly woman stood behind the counter, greeting him with a gentle smile. Welcome. Would you like a room for the night? Kazuki paid for his stay and received a key. Dinner will be served in the dining hall, but please, do not look out the window at night. Her words were sudden, unsettling. What? The fog grows thick at night. If you open the window, you might lose your way. She smiled again, as if the warning was nothing unusual. Something about it made him uneasy, but he was too tired to argue. After dinner, he returned to his room. It was simple but comfortable, with a warm bed and working heating. Kazuki took a shower and decided to sleep early. As the night deepened, he noticed the fog outside growing denser. From the window he could see white mist slowly swallowing the trees. Don't look outside, huh? The more he was told not to, the more he wanted to. Curiosity won. He carefully pulled back the curtain, just a little. Nothing. The fog was too thick. He couldn't even see the trees anymore. Then he noticed something. A silhouette. A shadowy figure stood in the mist, unmoving. It was watching him. A chill ran down his spine. The figure began to move. Slowly, Kazuki yanked the curtain shut and jumped back into bed, his heart pounding. It's just my imagination. Just the fog. He repeated the words in his head, squeezing his eyes shut. Then, in the middle of the night, knock, knock. A sound woke him. He checked the clock. 2 a.m. Who's there? A staff member? A lost traveler? He held his breath and listened. Knock, knock. It wasn't the door. It was the window. Kazuki pulled the covers over himself, trying not to breathe. Who would be knocking at the window at this hour? Knock, knock. Then, the curtain started to pull back. Not by the wind, by someone's hand. Kazuki's throat tightened. Through the slowly opening curtain, something was peering inside. It was not human. A pale face, hollow black eyes, a mouth stretched too wide, twisted at an unnatural angle. Kazuki instinctively shut his eyes. His heart pounded in his ears. If you look, you will be taken. The innkeeper's words echoed in his mind. Shaking, he hid under the blankets and forced his eyes shut. At some point the knocking stopped. By morning the world outside was normal again. The fog had cleared. Birds chirped. Relieved, Kazuki packed his things and went downstairs. The innkeeper was waiting. Did you sleep well? For a moment he considered telling her about last night, but something in her smile told him she already knew. Yeah, I guess. As he stepped outside, something felt off. The inn's sign was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Kazuki did not look back. He kept walking. He never returned to that countryside again. But at night, knock, knock. A faint sound began to echo outside his window.
If you're still here.
The Vanishing Village. In the remote mountains of Japan, there was a rumor about a village that didn't exist on any map. Those who wandered into it were said to never return. And if they did, they were no longer the same. Ryusuke was an avid hiker, someone who enjoyed exploring deep mountain trails on his days off. That day, he had taken an old, little-used path that led deep into the woods. The trail markers were faded, and thick foliage covered parts of the path, making it clear that few people had traveled this way. Maybe it's time to turn back. Just as the thought crossed his mind, he heard something. A faint bell ringing. Somewhere in the distance, the soft chime of a bell carried through the trees. A temple? Out here? Curious, he stepped off the main path and followed the sound. The trail grew narrower, the trees denser. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up, revealing a village. A village that shouldn't exist. The place was eerily quiet. Wooden houses lined the path, their structures aged but still intact. Laundry hung from clotheslines. Shoes were neatly placed outside doorsteps, but there were no people. "Hello?" Ryusuke called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. No answer. No wind. No birds. Just silence. At the center of the village stood a large torii gate. Beyond it, a set of crumbling stone steps led up to what appeared to be a small shrine. Maybe someone is there. As he stepped toward it, he felt a presence. Someone was watching him. He turned sharply. At the end of a narrow alley, a figure stood. Tall. Too tall. Its arms were unnaturally long. Its head was tilted slightly, as if observing him. Ryusuke's breath caught in his throat. Had it always been there? He took a step back. The figure V took a step forward. Every instinct in him screamed, "Run." He spun around and sprinted toward the shrine. The stone steps were crumbling underfoot as he climbed. His heart pounded. Then something caught his eye. A human hand. It was half buried in the dirt near the shrine, its fingers curled unnaturally. As Ryusuke recoiled, something creaked behind him. All the doors in the village were opening at once. From the houses, shadows began to emerge. He bolted. Running past the shrine, he tore through the forest, branches whipping against his skin, but behind him, something was crawling. A low, dragging sound, rustling, scraping. Something inhuman was following. "I have to get out." Then, the forest suddenly opened. Ryusuke stumbled onto a familiar mountain path. He turned around. The village was gone. Nothing but trees, no sign of any buildings, as if it had never existed. Days later, he told his hiking friends about what he had seen. "There's no village out there," one of them said. "Nothing like that exists." Had he imagined it? Then, a knock at his door. Knock, knock. 2 a.m. His heart pounded. Who would come at this hour? He hesitated, then opened the door. No one was there. Only the quiet night, but on the ground. A single straw sandal, just like the ones he had seen outside the houses in that village. Ryusuke slammed the door shut. That night he didn't open it again. But ever since then, knock, knock. The quiet tapping still comes, every night.
Subscribe if you dare.
The Dark Well. In a remote village in Italy, there was a legend about a well that must never be looked into. Those who peered inside were said to never return. And if they did, they were no longer themselves. Tatsuya was a traveler who loved exploring the old towns of Europe. That day, he had been driving through quiet countryside roads, avoiding the usual tourist spots. "I didn't expect to find a village here." As the sun began to set, He arrived at a small village. Stone-built houses lined the road, and an old bell tower stood in the central square, its structure worn with age. But something was wrong. There were no people. Laundry hung from balconies, mail was stuck in doorways, but there was no sign of life. Uneasy, he wandered further into the village, and then he saw it. A weathered stone well stood in a quiet corner of the square. Strange, faded writing was etched into the rim, as if it were meant to ward off something. Do not look. Tatsuya swallowed hard. It's just a superstition. But the warning only made him more curious. Slowly he stepped forward and peered inside. Nothing. Just endless darkness. Then you saw a whisper right next to his ear. Tatsuya stumbled back. He turned sharply. No one was there. The trees rustled, but there was no wind. From deep within the well, he heard a sound. Something was climbing up. Panic surged through him, and he staggered away. But then his shadow was gone. What? His heart pounded. No matter which way he turned, the ground beneath him was empty. And then he saw it. His shadow was in the well. It was looking up at him. It had his shape, but it was smiling. The shadow moved. On its own. No, 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 no. Tatsuya took a step back, and at that moment, the shadow crawled out of the well. It pulled itself up, its body twisting unnaturally, moving upside down. Go back, it whispered in his own voice. Tatsuya screamed and ran. The next morning he woke up by the roadside, far from the village. He looked back. The village was gone. He tried searching for it, but no map showed any record of its existence. But something was still wrong. His shadow moved a fraction of a second late. Since that day, he stopped looking in mirrors, because sometimes, at night, the reflection of his shadow would smile.
Subscribe if you dare.
The House of Red Strings. In a certain provincial city in China, there was a rumor about an abandoned house known as the House of Red Strings. It was said that anyone who stepped inside would encounter strange phenomena and never return, and if they did, they were no longer the same, no longer themselves. Shota, a university student, had a hobby of investigating urban legends. That day, he invited his friends Ren and Yuji to explore the infamous House of Red Strings. It's just superstition, right? And what's with the red strings anyway? You'll see when we get there. The locals refused to tell them where the house was, but after gathering information online, they finally pinpointed its location. That night, they arrived at the outskirts of town, where the abandoned house stood. It was a 2-story wooden structure. The walls were blackened with age, and the roof tiles were crumbling. But the most unsettling part was the red strings wrapped tightly around the front door handle. Some kind of prank, Ren muttered. Without hesitation, Shota pushed the door open. At that moment, the door silently shut behind them. Inside, the house was surprisingly well preserved. Dust covered the furniture, but everything else remained intact, as if frozen in time. See? Just another abandoned house. Yuji laughed as he walked further in, but Shota quickly noticed something strange. Red strings were tangled throughout the house. They hung from the ceiling, crawled along the floor, and wove through the gaps between furniture. This is unsettling, Ren muttered. Just then, creak. A sound came from upstairs. Someone's here? The three of them exchanged glances before cautiously ascending the staircase. At the end of the second-floor hallway, there was a single door. And in front of it, layers upon layers of red strings were woven tightly together. Looks like a warning, Yuji whispered. But Shota ignored it and reached out, pushing through the strings to open the door. Inside, there was nothing. Just an empty room. What the hell? Nothing here? At that moment, bam! The door slammed shut. Hey, cut it out. Shota grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It won't open? Ren and Yuji panicked, pushing from the other side. Something's blocking it, but the door showed no visible signs of obstruction. Only the red strings trembled slightly, as if something inside the room had moved. Shota swallowed hard, and then something shifted behind him. Shota, open the door. Ren and Yuji pounded on the door, but Shota couldn't move. Something was behind him. He must not turn around. His instincts screamed it, yet his legs trembled, and then something soft brushed against his neck, a red string. In that instant, his vision was swallowed by crimson. The next morning, Ren and Yuji had fled the house, leaving Shota behind. They called the police and returned to the site. But the house was gone. All that remained was an empty, barren lot. No, it was here. Just last night. Ren's voice wavered. At their feet, a single red string lay in the dirt. And slowly, it moved, as if something was still there.
If you're still here.
The foggy graveyard. In a remote part of England, there was a legend about a graveyard that must never be entered at night. Those who stepped inside were said to never return, and if they did, they were no longer the same. Alex, a university history major, was researching old graveyards. That day, he and his friends Lucas and Emily visited an ancient cemetery deep in the countryside. During the daytime, the graveyard seemed ordinary. Rows of weathered tombstones stood in eerie silence. So this is the haunted cemetery? Looks pretty normal to me. Lucas shrugged. But the locals refused to go near it, Emily murmured. They casually walked among the graves, taking photos and jotting down notes. Then, just as the sun began to set, something changed. A thick fog rolled in. It came unnaturally fast, swallowing the entire graveyard within seconds. What the hell? This fog came out of nowhere. Lucas sounded uneasy. Where's the exit? Emily turned around frantically, but the path they had come from was gone. The once visible trail leading out of the cemetery had vanished into the mist. This way! Alex pushed forward, trying to navigate through the grave markers. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath his feet felt strange. It was too soft, as if something was shifting below. And then, knock, knock. A hollow sound echoed through the fog. Did you hear that? Lucas's voice trembled. No one answered, but the sound continued. Knock, knock. Someone, or something, was tapping on a tombstone. No, it wasn't someone. From within the fog, figures began to appear. Shadowy, indistinct forms rising from behind the graves. Oh my God. Alex felt his breath hitch. The figures were walking toward them. But something was wrong. None of them had faces. Their heads were blurred, as if swallowed by the fog itself. Emily let out a choked scream. "Run!" Alex shouted. The three of them sprinted through the cemetery.
but there was no exit. "This graveyard isn't that big. We should have reached the edge by now," Lucas panted, but no matter how far they ran, the tombstones never ended. The graveyard itself was changing. And then they saw it. The same tombstone they had passed minutes ago. "We're going in circles," Lucas whispered in horror. Just then, Emily froze. "Guys, look." She raised a trembling hand, pointing into the fog. Beyond the mist, a person stood among the graves. They wore the same clothes as Alex and the others, but they had no face. Just a hollow, shapeless void where their features should have been. The figure took a step forward. The next thing they knew, they were outside the cemetery. The morning sun had risen, and the fog was gone. "We made it back?" Lucas asked in disbelief. Emily, still shaking, nodded. Alex turned back toward the graveyard. It looked normal, just an ordinary cemetery. Was it all just a dream? Then, Alex's eyes widened. For a brief moment, his shadow moved in the wrong direction. Since that night, Alex never walked outside when it was foggy, because sometimes in the mist, he could feel someone watching him.
Subscribe if you dare.
Chapter 4. The Hands from Below. In a remote region of Germany, there was a legend about a forbidden basement, a place no one should ever descend into. Those who stepped inside were said to never return, and if they did, they were no longer themselves. Marcus, an architect specializing in historical restoration, had been assigned to renovate an old manor. Built in the 18th century, the mansion was a grand stone structure, but it had been abandoned for years. Its halls were empty, its walls crumbling. It's incredible that a place like this still stands. Marcus walked through the corridors, making notes on his plans for renovation. Then, after some time, he noticed something odd. There was no entrance to the basement. A building of this size should have a basement, perhaps a storage space or a wine cellar. Strange. Checking the old blueprints, he found something chilling. The mansion was supposed to have a basement. Yet, no entrance existed. He searched for a while until he finally found it. A hidden door. Behind a dusty bookshelf, a small wooden door was wedged into the stone wall. Why is this here? He pressed against it. Creak. The rusty hinges groaned as the door slowly opened. Beyond it, a dark stairwell leading downward. The stairs were far deeper than he expected. Broken lamps lined the walls, long since extinguished. Marcus switched on his flashlight and carefully descended. The air grew unnaturally cold. What is this chill? At the bottom, he stepped into a vast underground chamber, and then he saw it. The walls were covered in handprints. Hundreds of them, scratched, carved, and etched deep into the stone. Some were large, others small. They overlapped and intertwined like desperate claw marks. What the hell? Marcus reached out and touched the wall. At that moment, something touched him back. He yanked his hand away. But no one was there, or so he thought, until he noticed the floor. It moved, a subtle, pulsing shift beneath his feet. I need to get out of here. His instincts screamed at him. Marcus turned toward the stairs, but then, rustle, rustle. The handprints on the walls began to move. No way. And then, hands began crawling out of the stone. This can't be real. Marcus staggered backward. Withered, skeletal hands dragged themselves out of the walls, reaching for him. I have to get out. He bolted for the stairs, But the staircase was gone. Where there had been stone steps just moments ago, now there was only a smooth black wall, no way out. This is impossible. He pounded on the wall, desperate. Then a whisper slithered through the air. You belong here now. Scrape, scrape. The hands moved closer. No, stay away. Marcus stumbled back. Then he realized. His legs wouldn't move. Looking down, his blood ran cold. The hands were gripping his ankles. Let go, he screamed, but slowly. They pulled him into the wall. The next morning, the mansion's caretaker arrived for an inspection. Marcus, where are you? There was no sign of him, only the hidden door. Behind the bookshelf, slightly ajar. Curious, the caretaker peered inside. But there was no stairwell, only a blank stone wall. Strange. As he turned to leave, he failed to notice something. A fresh handprint had appeared on the wall, the size of Marcus's hand.